Now introduce our four panelists that we have with us today, and I'll introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking to us. First up, we are going to have two panelists from Church World Service. They have been Church World Service has been advancing the goal of building a world in which there is enough for all for the past 7 decades. Among their primary areas of focus are poverty, hunger, displacement, and disaster. All of those relate to today's topic, and we're fortunate to have two of their staff members. Andrew Fuse is the Senior Director for Church World Services Immigration and Refugee Program. He has worked in various capacities for the past 10 years and almost 6 months to the day, as I understand it. He's been at Church World Service, working in a variety of capacities. And we also have with us Jasmine Huggins, who is their Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer. And she has worked all over the world from London to the Caribbean, and currently she is going to be joining us from Belgrade, Serbia. So great to have both Jasmine and Andrew with us. Then after Jasmine, we'll have Ruth Ivory Moore, who directs the Environment and Corporate Social Responsibility Program for the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And she works with the ACT Alliance Coalition of Church Organizations to address climate migration. And before entering the faith-based environmental world, she worked in the fields of both chemical engineering and the law. And then finally, we will be joined by Mary Schaller-Blofis, who is the team leader of Humanitarian and Development Ministries for the United Church of Christ. Mary has worked and taught abroad in Bangalore, India. She's a published author with her most recent book entitled Experiments in Mutuality, the UCC and Global Mission from 1985 to 2010. So those are our panelists for today, and we will start things off with you, Andrew, if you'd like to take things away.
Great, thanks, Brooks. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Brooks, can you confirm that you see my screen?
Yep, I see it. Looks good. Thanks.
Fantastic. I'll share briefly some context for our conversation, and then we'll look forward to hearing from other colleagues on sharing out some more specific examples. Globally, the statistics on migration reflect 258 million international migrants. That's men, women, girls and boys who've crossed international borders, and then another 763 million persons who are internal migrants, meaning moving within their own country. Increasingly, climate and climate change and climate-related impacts are intertwined with stories of migration and movement, as climate change is being viewed as a multiplier, a risk multiplier, particularly for forced migration. This takes place in the context of sudden onset crises such as storms, hurricanes, floods, where climate change is contributing to the intensity of weather events, changing the kinds of risks that people face from disaster-induced displacement. Climate change is also contributing to slow onset crises, which include rising sea levels, include drought, or even increasingly unpredictable rainfall patterns. We might know, for those of you who are students of US history, you may remember the Dust Bowl era in the 1930s, where there was a large internal migration from the Midwest to California, caused largely by drought and lack of rainfall. Last year, the World Bank commissioned a study to project the number of people who could be displaced internally over the next 30 years because of climate change and climate-related impacts. Estimate of 180 million people over the next 30 years. The data and projection systems for climate-related migration, and particularly forced migration and forced displacement, are still emerging. It's only over the last 10 years that one of the leading international organizations, IDMC, that monitors internal migration, internal displacement, has been collecting statistics on natural disaster-related displacement, including hurricanes and storms and floods and disasters related to climate. So this is one area where there's attention and an effort underway to try to increase the amount of information available to improve our understanding of the kinds and scales of climate-related migration and forced displacement, so as to inform and improve responses and mitigation. Going back to those two stats that I shared at the start, the bulk of migration displacement, both overall and related to climate, is internal migration taking place within national borders. In terms of movement and migration across national borders, even when people are moving in a forced migration, in terms of forced migration and being displaced involuntarily, because of climate-related factors, climate itself and the impacts of climate change are not grounds for legal protection as a refugee or as an asylee under international law, under U.S. national law, and for the most part under other countries' national laws. So one of the principles that's being lifted up globally and was highlighted as recently in December in the International Conference on Global Migration. Some of the key principles are solidarity, cooperation, cooperation across countries, across peoples and governments, and respecting the human rights for all persons on the move, regardless of what are the factors that's caused somebody to move and how forced or how voluntary the movement may be. There are other potential channels or existing legal channels that allow for people to move. Labor migration is one of the main legal instruments that exists for people to move from one country to another. This is largely dependent on labor demand and skills among people migrating. As a legal channel itself, it allows for access to migration, but doesn't necessarily mean that somebody's rights as a worker, as a migrant worker, are necessarily strong or upheld in the country where they've arrived. There are humanitarian visas, including forms of temporary humanitarian protection, which tend to be provided more after extreme natural disasters. So not necessarily being applied yet to those slow onset crises, nor yet being used in a way that facilitates migration as a way to avoid crises and the impact of crises before they occur. There's some consideration of new legal mechanisms, including in New Zealand. There's been some discussion of creating a climate displacement-based channel for migration, so a kind of climate visa for citizens of Pacific Island nations, so neighbors of New Zealand in the Pacific region, who are threatened by rising sea levels and are facing imminent forced displacement because of rising sea levels. And these would be something that could supplement existing channels for labor migration and other channels for migration. And so globally, I think there's an interest in trying to keep as strong and as wide as possible the existing migration channels. Labor migration is one tool, for example, where if a country recognizes that there are neighbors who have citizens at risk of being forcibly displaced, and there are already agreements for labor migration, the cap of migrants coming in from that country could be increased as a way of recognizing that as a risk. I think we also observe that there are multiple factors that can cause men, women, and children to be displaced. For example, in what we're observing with forced migration from Central America, the same family who is fleeing conflict or persecution could also be escaping suffering caused by extended drought or severe floods. That same family could also be seeking to reunite with relatives elsewhere. So I think it's important to bear in mind that there are many reasons that a given person or a given family may be on the move. There is not any one-size-fits-all solution at this point, and partly for that reason, in the absence of a global agreement on climate-related migration, it's critical to use the existing channels that are out there and to see how those can be built upon, maintained, and strengthened. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that's a useful opening and context, and turn it over to Jasmine.
Everybody, thank you very much for your patience. So I am speaking to you from Belgrade, capital of the Republic of Serbia in Eastern Europe. And I'm going to be speaking about three forms of climate injustice, which I have been working on for quite a while, and which I think could be could now become a greater part of the narrative that we are now pulling together on climate change and global migration, in as much as the climate change does not affect all groups equally, and so it's to try to understand how climate change has a disproportionate effect on some groups and on others, and to understand the different forms of injustice that I want to pay attention to today. So the first form of climate change, climate justice advocates tend to think we tend to speak of it in terms of a triple injustice. The first one is that, as you have already said, all of you, climate change is affecting impoverished groups first and foremost. And so this is the first injustice. Groups that are historically marginalized, excluded, or that face pervasive discrimination in their own countries tend to be the groups that are bearing the brunt, or facing the full force of climate change. These are also, who else is marginalized and excluded? Also, energy poor communities around the world that are still waiting to be connected to the grid. They are very impoverished, and they are often resource poor people who don't have the extra income necessary to adapt or to respond to droughts and storms and hurricanes and floods when they happen. Migrants and refugees, as we've already said, are impoverished and at risk and are more affected. In the developing world, in 2017, extreme weather disasters cost the developing world about $320 billion, huge amount of money. And people in low-income countries are 6 times more likely to lose all of their worldly possessions or suffer injury and disaster than people in high-income countries. So the first form of climate injustice is that they're already poor, they're facing structural marginalization, discrimination in their own countries, and they often tend to be very ignored by their own governments. Climate change is also not gender neutral. Gender inequality is a long-standing and pervasive injustice whereby there are gaps in life chances and opportunities and resources and rewards between men and women and boys and girls. And now we find more and more evidence that gender inequality is a root cause of poverty, and climate change is making poverty worse. And therefore, we can assume, and we're already beginning to see, that gender inequalities cannot be delinked from climate change. So as the climate changes, as temperatures rise, the differences between men and women are getting worse. The differences between boys and girls are getting worse, and that we need to now pay attention to how climate change could be exacerbating gender inequality, which already exists, or how it could be eroding some of the gains that have already been made by men and women in different places. And just to give you a few examples of that, natural disasters have a very clear gendered impact. For example, women and girls are often at greater physical risk during and after natural disasters. In Vanuatu, in the 2011 cyclone, after the 2011 cyclone, there was a 300% increase in domestic violence cases after the cyclone. Why? Because cyclones disrupt normal routines and often place women and girls in situations of risk where the normal protection and security measures are no longer available to them. Adolescent girls report high levels of sexual harassment and abuse following natural disasters, and this unfortunately is a global pattern. In other countries, men are more vulnerable. The death rate from extreme heat is 2.5 times greater for men than for women. And during Hurricane Mitch in Central America 2 decades ago, more men died, twice as many men died as women because of the norms around heroic behavior. So there were more men going out trying to do brave, masculine things, and they ended up dying. Gender also intersects with other vulnerabilities, such as ethnicity and race. In the United States, we have some evidence that African Americans and Hispanic children don't learn how to swim as much as other communities, and therefore they are more likely to drown during floods than others, which is a really tragic outcome of general racism and discrimination and marginalization. So as we try to prepare the faith community for the impact of climate change, we also need to weave into the narrative how social inequalities, which are structured, place certain groups more at risk than others. And we also need to really assume that the people who we think are going to be strong will always be strong. The second form of inequality is that, as we've already said, the people who are most affected did not cause the problem of climate change. So we know that the wealthiest countries have used up a disproportionate amount of the global carbon budget, and they are responsible for the highest emissions that cause climate change. The less and least developed countries have emitted less carbon. They're most affected, they're less prepared, and they're the least resourced to mitigate and to adapt. And they also have the least amount of power in global negotiations and also domestically to negotiate climate deals that are going to be beneficial for them. So that's the second form of inequality which climate justice advocates feel we need to be very, very clear-sighted about, that there is a disproportionate impact on the poor, but they did not cause the problem in the first place. And so we have to be very focused on how we can redress this multidimensional inequality. The third type of inequality, the third area of inequality, is that the countries that should have have a greater responsibility for the problem of climate change and have a greater capacity for addressing climate change should be paying and should be taking up a greater proportion of the burden of climate change, but they are not. And so this is the third form of climate injustice, that the polluters, we call this principle, in some parts of the literature it's called, that it's said that the polluters should pay, meaning those who have polluted the environment and who have put an enormous burden on the poorest countries and the poorest people in the poorest countries should have a higher degree, should pay more, and should mitigate more, and should pay more, and should compensate more. And these are some of the conversations that Ruth was referring to when she spoke about the UNFCCC and the concept of loss and damage. So climate advocates strongly suggest that countries, that the most responsible countries for carbon emissions should mitigate. They should drastically reduce their own carbon emissions. They should provide climate funding for climate adaptation and mitigation particularly to the poorest countries. They should preserve and grow foreign assistance and refugee budget lines because of what we've already said, that this problem of global displacement of people is going to be magnified as we go forward. And these are resource poor countries that don't have ready access to credit and that are already struggling with structural inequalities which prevent them from having a big say in how the climate negotiations and climate finance plays out. So the polluter countries should accept their responsibility to preserve and grow foreign assistance and refugee budget lines. They also should address global inequality. This is one of the key asks of the climate justice advocates, that climate change is in fact a symptom of a growing global inequality between rich and poor, between developed and developing countries, but also within wealthy countries, between wealthy communities and rich communities in the north. So the climate advocates strongly recommend that we, as part of our climate justice narrative, we should be looking at global inequality writ large. The concentration of wealth, the rising inequality, and how does that make climate vulnerable people that much more vulnerable, and what is the role of wealthy countries in addressing that inequality. Another area in which polluters need to pay is to help in the resettlement of disaster displaced people, not just in the north, but within the south. Within the south, people are going to be moving within, crossing country lines and crossing national borders between countries, and what is the role of wealthy countries in helping that resettlement to happen, let's say, within a continent and not necessarily between Africa to North America, but within Africa or within Asia or within Latin America. And then finally, the question of rights, that polluters should pay, but they should also accept the responsibility and the reality of climate change driven displacement. And Andrew's already spoken about some of that conversation which is beginning to happen in some countries like New Zealand, and in other countries there's some examples of legislation which is coming up, and which is trying to look at the issue of people on the move as a result of climate displacement, but still it's not yet recognized sufficiently within the international system that polluters have a responsibility to recognize the rights of climate affected people to be assisted and to be supported through the process of adapting to climate change. We have, as climate justice advocates, a central concern about rights, the rights of people to have access to services and have access to support, irrespective of gender, age, class, religion, ethnicity, sexuality. States have an obligation to take individual and collective measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and their adverse impact, but also they have an obligation to assist people who are vulnerable and who are preparing for climate change. Vulnerable people don't always know their rights, and so this is a very important concept for us as climate justice advocates, that our advocacy work needs to be informed by a rights-based approach in which we help climate affected people to understand that they do have rights. So finally, what could be the role of our role as a faith community in addressing this triple injustice of climate change? Essentially, to recognize that social inequality and the injustice of climate change not only reinforce each other, but they have common roots. And so our role is to try to understand these common roots of structural injustice generally and structural injustice as it relates to climate change and how they reinforce each other. I'll leave it there so that we can come back to conversation. I think we still have a few minutes. Thank you.
Oh, what I want to talk about a little bit today is just what some of the churches are doing on forced migration. And first, I just give a little bit of background, is that for one thing, as everybody knows, the faith-based community is well positioned to address or to work with migrants. For one thing, we are there. Many faith organizations have well-established footprints across the world. We can relate. Oftentimes, migrants really do not want to speak to someone outside of their faith. They want to speak to someone who's in their faith. We're also trusted. We're trusted by governmental authorities. So we're a good entity. And we work from a power in the fact that our power comes from God. So we have a powerful voice when we're working with migrants. And as early as 2009, the church leaders in the specific released a statement or declaration, the Moana Statement, which noted then that climate change threatened forced relocation and displacement of people at that time. So it's been for a while that we've known that climate change could have a significant impact on migration and forced migration, leading to climate refugees. I want to talk a little bit about what ACT Alliance does. Then I'll talk a little bit about Lutheran World Federation, Bread for the World Germany, and then a little bit what ELCA is doing in the area of climate refugees. ACT Alliance is a coalition of 150 churches and church-related organizations around the globe. It's supported by about 25,000 staff members from different organizations. They focus on 3 targeted areas: humanitarian aid, development, and advocacy. And one of the documents that they actually produce is related to climate advocacy. In this document, what they're doing is relating climate change to induced migration, and they talk about the moral imperative that communities and nations need to commit to avert loss and damages, that is, to minimize the loss of lives and assets. And they also work to put in place measures to implement the Paris Agreement. And in the Paris Agreement, there were positions taken to recognize loss and damages as the 3rd pillar of climate action, along with mitigation and adaptation.
Okay, sorry about that. The internet went and then my landline went. So sorry about that, everybody. And where I left off was talking about ACT Alliance. And what ACT Alliance does is focus on 3 areas: humanitarian, development, and advocacy. As part of development and or advocacy, they produce a number of resources. And one of the resources was a new report they produced at the end of 2018, which did one of the profound effects or impacts of climate change. And in addition to that, they also present, as part of their advocacy, they participate very heavily in, they have a significant presence at all of the UN FCCC's climate conferences. At this past conference, COP24, which is called COP24, they held a side event. And what they did at the side event was to focus on the impact of climate change on forced migrations. And as part of that, ACT Alliance also works with other entities such as Climate Action Network International, Sustainable Development Policy Institute, Action Aid, and they put on this panel. And as part of that panel, they brought to light the risks to people who are forced to migrate due to climate change. And they made it very impressive on the audience that this is a very large issue. And they talked about the IPCC report, which was the Intergovernmental Panel Report on Climate Change, which was issued in October of last year, which talked about the urgency of addressing climate change now. And then I just want to talk a little bit about what Lutheran World Federation is doing in Central America and what Bread for the World is doing, and a little bit about ELCA. Lutheran World Federation is a communion of churches in the Lutheran faith, and they span about 148 churches around the globe, representing about 75.5 million people totally in about 99 countries. And migration is one of the main issues for them in addressing migration, particularly in Central America, is a key issue for them. They are also trying to address the root causes, because most entities understand that people really do not want to move, or if they do move, they should move of their own free will. So what LWF, Lutheran World Federation, is doing is addressing some of the root causes of migration to try to decrease the flow of men, women, and youth each year. And I just want to talk about two families. One is an El Salvador family, and another one is from Honduras. Another is just one family. And then the caravan that we heard about a little bit just before the election in last year. To give an example of what can happen, that one family was migrated. The father left his family in El Salvador and moved to the U.S. It wasn't by choice, it was by force. And the reason he had to leave is because he's a fisherman. And what's been happening there is that he found that he had to leave, so he had to take the dangerous trip from his home to go to America because he's a fisherman. But what's happening in his area is that the rising sea is bringing sand, which blocks the entrance of river, and the sand and the tidal flows into the forest and now no longer moves back. Now the trees, which are the mangroves, are permanently standing in water heated by the sun. So they in their home, and what that means is that the fish are migrating out. They're not having the mangroves. There are birds that are migrating. So he had to leave his family for 6 years and go to the States. He was able to send money back, and then finally he was able to come back to his hometown. What LWF is doing in certain communities like these is they're trying to help these localities, these local organizations to address these problems. For example, in this case, they're digging irrigation trenches and replanting trees in the worst affected area. And they're trying to create an environment so not only that the fish come back, but they're also trying to create an environment where the people do not have to leave. But this will take time. For example, there's one family that I'm talking about. Their son left for Mexico in March of last year, but he was kidnapped on the way there by gangs that target migrants. And his relatives in the U.S. had to pay $3,000 US dollars to get him released. So again, there's a significant danger there. And then in Honduras, I think a lot of us saw a lot of the caravans that were on TV just before the elections in the U.S. We heard a lot about the phenomenon of the caravans, and we heard a lot of misinformation coming about the caravan. But they didn't hear a lot about why the people were leaving. A lot of these people are leaving because they're fleeing or getting away from violence. The other reason they're leaving also is because of food insecurity, because of hunger, because of climate change. There have been significant impact on agriculture due to droughts, which leads to hunger and increased poverty. One thing LWF is doing there is trying to work with the entities, again, work with the people there to try to see if they can prevent people from leaving if they don't want to. So in responding to need for income and jobs, LWF has offered programs and training for employment in such areas as carpentry, electricity, welding, and also providing equipment and materials for startup of community and family businesses. They're also training people on human rights advocacy, doing how to advocate on behalf of human rights. I want to talk a little bit about what Bread for the World Germany has done in Bangladesh and some learnings they have learned there. A little bit about Bread for the World. It is a global entity, development and relief organization of Protestant churches in Germany. It has more than 90 countries in which around the globe where they work to help the poor and the marginalized. Particularly, and they could look at almost any area they've done, but they did some work in Bangladesh, and specifically as it relates to climate change. They found that climate change refugees need an official recognition. I think, as Andrew mentioned before, there is no legal recognition of the term climate refugee. So there needs to be a recognition so that services can be provided. Climate change affects the right to adequate housing. The right to adequate housing is a basic human right. And Climate change impacts that. Climate refugees need to be adequately addressed within the UNFCCC process. National policies, whether you're in internet beyond the states or wherever, need to address the problem or the concerns of climate refugees. Climate-induced migration needs to be addressed on a local level as well as on a national level. And government entities should improve support for climate refugees. And now I just want to talk a little bit about the Amparo program that EOCA has. It goes back to 2014 when the media put a significant spotlight on the humanitarian crisis of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, where they saw around 70,000 unaccompanied children and another 70,000 individuals in family units coming to the U.S. In 2015, this number decreased initially significantly, but then increased. Then the deportations of Central Americans in Mexico increased sharply. The EOCA became significantly aware of that and began to put together a program to address these unaccompanied minors. And this program is called Amparo. And Amparo stands for Accompanying Migrant Minors in Protection, Advocacy, Representation, and Opportunities. And it focuses on 3 primary areas of accompaniment, awareness building, and advocacy. The purpose of the principles that Amparo is focused on is to uphold and guarantee basic human rights and safety of migrant children and families. It addresses the root cause of migration from these Central American countries, which is, again, is violence, but also poverty, which is induced by food insecurity due to climate change. And the program works to adjust the humane policies affecting migrants inside and outside of the U.S., and it engages the church body of all our companions in addressing these issues. And what I had planned to do was to close my portion in a prayer, and that prayer is, bless all those who are, through no fault of their own, are forced to flee their homes and take, along with family, only that which they can carry, and seek a safer place to live. Remind us, our Savior, who, as a child, was also a refugee, finding shelter in a foreign land, and give us hearts and hands willing to reach out and help these distant relatives within our worldwide family. Amen. And I will send this, my slide to Brooks so he can send it out to everyone. And I do apologize. This could not have happened at a worse time. The internet at our facility just went out, and so did our landline.
So as you're hearing from the colleagues that work with these global systems of faith-based organizations, of faith communities, that the churches, faith communities are well positioned to be very influential and have been doing this for as long as we've been in partnership with each other and churches around the world. And so my contribution to this is to personalize it a little bit. So in the order of how technology is helping us to make these presentations, I'm going to offer just a little personal story in the midst of some of these larger statistics and larger networks. And that is, you've heard talk about the statement from the Pacific Islands as early as 2009. You've heard about the New Zealand area islands that are being taken over by rising sea levels. Well, Reverend Tafu Lusama is General Secretary of the church in Tuvalu. And Tuvalu is a country, and I am going to try to show you here a picture of Tuvalu. It is a country in the Pacific, There are actually, it's a country that is made up of 9 islands scattered over a period, over 420 miles. It's reefs. It is very low lying. In fact, most of the island is maybe 13, 16 feet above sea level. And because it is so close to sea level, the rising level of the seas impacts it tremendously. It is also an island where there are no rivers. And so all of the drinking water is that comes from catching the rain and wells. Well, climate change has caused these rivers to dry up and the wells to dry. It's an island where Reverend Tafue tells us that many of the people already on the island work or go to school or are someplace off island. And one way that people on the island are able to survive is by remittances that come back to people on the island. Because of the drought and the drying up of fresh water, not only do they have rising sea level, but now the lack of fresh drinking water. And Reverend Tafue tells us that it's a bit like they are the canary in the coal mine. That as climate change makes these both slow onset and disaster related changes, that people are being impacted not only in their livelihoods, but in their very life. And it is a culture where a house just isn't a house, but the land is part of the identity of the people. And the culture that is not just as easy as, well, go live someplace else, but it's the need to sustain the culture as well. And so I think Reverend Tafue and those in the Pacific Islands offer us a face and a real life story that these vast movements are also something that are very personal and very much impacting real lives and real cultures. I will pause there and see if we have our other panelists back online.
Ruth is not back on, but Jasmine has been able to join us. So when you complete your presentation, we'll transition over to Jasmine.
Well, I would just then make the segue into in the United Church of Christ, and I know many of you on this call are related to the United Church of Christ, many of you are not. One of the things that coming up at this summer's General Synod meeting of the United Church of Christ, which is our every 2 years our national body meets together, there will be a resolution of witness coming before that body on global forced migration. And as part of that, it's looking at the scope of how church has been and continues to be involved in adaptation. Reverend Michael, I was about to say mitigation. In adaptation of related to climate change, related to disaster, related to global church partnerships, and the technical and global relationships that are hopefully going to lead us towards some kind of a global agreement on forced migration.
And thank you to each of our panelists for those terrific presentations. In the Christian tradition, we sometimes say that in the kingdom to come, there will be no technical difficulties. And so we understand those challenges that can arise. I certainly have experienced them myself. So thank you to each of our panelists. We're coming to our final minutes here. And I know we've got questions that have come in, but I do want to kind of end us on, we like to always close our webinar sessions with a call to action. And so, Michael, I invite you to kind of reflect for us on what would be a call for action here for us.
Yeah, so again, in our Christian tradition, we follow the teachings of Christ and the way of Christ. And he made a point to let us know that there were people that were presented to the kingdom, and they were divided up between two. And there were some that were offered eternal life and eternal presence with God, and then there were some that were cast off. And the reason being is because the mandates were given to feed the hungry and to give water to the thirsty and to welcome the stranger and give clothes to the naked and see about the sick and visit those that are imprisoned. And some did those things, and those were the ones that were able to inherit, but then there were those that weren't. But in essence, I think the bottom line that Jesus was trying to point out to us is that we ought to get involved. And in some way, shape, form, or fashion, we should get involved. We should get involved through our prayer life, but we should get involved through our public life as well. And then we should get involved in our private life and through our pulpits. So everything that we should, that we embody as ministers, everything that we embody as those who lead organizations for good, those who are doing good for people, we ought to get involved and embody being involved. And one of the ways that we can get involved is through the UCC Refugee Accompaniment Network or the UCC Immigration Collaborative, so that you can get specific access to various opportunities and events with accompaniment. So those are things that you can do to get involved. If you look at your comments in the chat section, you'll see the message that tells us about that particular resource, as well as it gives us names for Amanda Sheldon, and as well as, who was it that, Mary, as well as Mary, that gave us, or that you can get in touch with concerning that particular program. But there's also others that are on the line as well and on the call that are part of the UCC, that are part of outside organizations. And I always will end with representing IPL. Get involved with your local chapters of your Interfaith Power and Lights. These are things that we not only fight for and advocate and educate on, but these are things that we can definitely use your involvement as to help us to spearhead as well. You as faith leaders, you as those who work in communities of faith, are the voices that we need. Thank you.